Namaste and good evening. I, Swati Salanki, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान नई दिल्ली extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered for a panel discussion on employment and unemployment scenario. Where are we and where are we going? As a part of the series, The State of Employment and Livelihoods, #employment debate. The series is organized by IMPRI Center for Work and Welfare, Indian Social Institute, New Delhi, and Counterview. The moderator of our today's session is Professor K.R. Shyam Sundar. Sir is professor in HRM area at XLRI, Xavier School of Management, Jamshedpur. We welcome you, sir. It is my privilege to introduce our esteemed panelists for this very important discussion. We have with us Dr. Gayathri Vasudevan. Ma'am is Executive Chairperson at LabourNet, Bengaluru. We welcome you, ma'am. We also have with us Dr. Radhicka Kapoor. Ma'am is Senior Visiting Fellow at Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, ICRIER, New Delhi. And Dr. Ishan Anand, who is Assistant Professor at Jindal Global Law School. We welcome you, sir. As a discussant for this talk, we have with us Dr. Rahul Suresh Sapkal. Sir is Assistant Professor at Center for Policy Studies, IIT Bombay, Mumbai. My heartiest welcome to you all for today's pertinent discussion. Now, I would like to invite our moderator, Professor K.R. Shyam Sundar, sir, to initiate the discussion with his opening remarks and invite the panelists to take this discussion forward. We really look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering today. Sir, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At the outset, I would like to thank IMPRI Center for Work and Welfare and the Institute and the Indian Social Institute, New Delhi, and Counterview for organizing this very topical, even quite matter of grave concern, employment and unemployment scenario in India, which has been, which situation has been exacerbated thanks to COVID. And we have eminent panelists with us. I'll just make a few opening remarks and then I'll request the panelists to make the presentation. Employment and unemployment has always been a matter of concern, but it has become more so because of the COVID situation. The PLFS 2019-20 reported a substantial rise of 3.5% points as compared to PLFS 2017-18 in workforce participation rates for all workers in both rural and urban India, driven due to a sharp rise in female workforce participation rates, which rose from 16.5 in 2017-18 to 21.8. This is a remarkable growth, and we have witnessed it in a short-term period of just 2 years. On the other hand, the overall unemployment rates, after reaching the historically high of 6.1% in 2017-8, as compared to the earlier decades, declined marginally to 5.8% in 2018-19, and a sharp fall to 4.8% during 2019-20. And it is significant to note that 2019-20, that is for the PLFS, includes COVID-19 initial periods, which witnessed substantial spikes in the unemployment and decline in the workforce participation rates because of the tremendous, near universal lockdown or very, widespread lockdown. On the other hand, the recent quarterly employment survey by Labour Bureau, comprising 9 sectors like manufacturing, construction, education, IT, BPO, etc., reported 29% increase in employment, total employment, as compared to the 6th economic census. And some sectors like IT, BPO witnessed fantastic growth rates like 152%, health sector 77%. And understandably, trade and accommodation had witnessed a decline. And of course, the payroll data, which the government has often been using, has shown, despite its fluctuations, a rosy picture of the formal workforce, a growth in the formal workers' growth. So what we get from the official statistics is that labor market is recovering and doing in fact well. So the unwary readers who read these popular dailies or even the business dailies they might be forgiven for believing that the economy is on the so-called V, on the recovery path and even on the growth path. And labor economists and trade unions are going to contest them, like we are going to see now. I know Prof. Radhicka Kapoor has written in an article in the Indian Express, and she had questioned the veracity of this kind of recovery in labor market scenario, and trade unions have been showcasing or putting forth numerous micro level experiences which are real in order to say that official statistics are not validated at the micro level. In fact, Professor Radhicka Kapoor and Mr. Magesh Vyas and various others have argued that one should use the current weekly status form of data rather than the UPSS data that the government has been using, because the CWS is globally well known. And of course, economists like Professor Arup Mitra has even questioned the reliability of PLFS. And trade unions have always have never accepted the official statistics. So that means we are in a web of controversies, both informed and from the field. So where are we? I mean, where are we? The question itself is becoming controversial. Where we are going to be, that is going to be far more controversial. Is it political economy, or it is some kind? Are these scientific deductions that can be made? A lot of questions arise. So I won't steal the thunder from the panelists by making any more observations, but I would like to say that economic statistics in general and labor statistics in particular probably is undergoing some kind of a political economy manipulation. It might be a feasible hypothesis to project the ruling party to be doing well. It may be NDA, it may be UPA, but it is the political economy. This is what I guess, but I leave it to the panelists to unravel the data and show us the pictures. So we have a wonderful panel. We have Professor Radhicka Kapoor, Senior Visiting Fellow from ICRIER, and we have Dr. Gayathri Vasudevan, who is the Executive Chairperson, LabourNet from Bengaluru, and Dr. Ishan Anand, Assistant Professor from Jindal Global Law School. So I mean, this is the best possible eminent panel that we could have on board. So I have the pleasure of inviting Professor Radhicka Kapoor to share her views. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Shyam, Sundar, and thank you very much, Dr. Kumar, for inviting me yet again to speak at this forum. I really like the title of this discussion, where are we and where are we going? And I want to add one more dimension to it, which is how we got here, because understanding how we got here is equally important. And I'll broadly divide my remarks into two categories. The first will be about, analyzing the trends, and that will help answer where we are and where we are going. And the second set of remarks will be about the data, because like Professor Shyam Sundar said, a lot of the issues that confront us are also a function of the nature of the data that we have and how we choose to interpret and analyze it. So So let me start first with looking at what the trends tell us. And here I'm basically going to rely on the NSS employment unemployment household surveys and the PLFS annual rounds, because I actually have complete faith in that data. I think it provides us with a very accurate picture, a very representative picture of what's going on in the labor market. But of course, one needs to look beyond the unemployment rate to actually unravel and dissect some of the trends that Professor Shyam Sundar was outlining in the beginning. So the reason I also start from 2004-5 in analyzing these trends is because that was a period when India witnessed very high growth. And of course, growth has been slowing down after 2015-16. So it's often argued that the fact that we're not creating enough jobs is a function of the fact that we're not creating enough quality jobs is a function of the fact that growth hasn't been rapid enough. But the fact is that even when we were doing very well and witnessing pretty stupendous rates of growth, we were not actually creating very good quality jobs for those who were seeking these jobs. So I'll start with the most basic metric, which we all look at when we analyze the unemployment, when we analyze the labor market, which is the unemployment rate. And here, if you look at the unemployment rate by the usual status, what you find is that before 2017-18, in both the 2004-5 and the 2011-12 quinquennial rounds, the unemployment rate basically fluctuated between 2 to 2.5%. This was regardless of whether you looked at male, female, or you combined the whole total together. And 17-18 was really an inflection point in the data, because that is when you saw almost a doubling, and in some cases a trebling of the open unemployment rate. That is the year when we saw a big jump in the unemployment rate from 2.1 to 6.1% by the usual status, and that was the time when I think it was in some sense a breaking point of the series, because to this point we often argue that India had a problem of underemployment, which has been there actually forever. And if you go back even to the 50s, before the NSS survey started, Professor K.N. Raj has this very interesting article in 1959 where he talks about the problem of underemployment, disguised unemployment in India back then. And he says that the future of India is going to be contingent on its ability to create quality jobs for its young population. So that challenge has very much been there. But in 17-18, the nature of the challenge got exacerbated, because we not only had the problem of underemployment, but also open unemployment increased significantly. And no matter how you slice and dice the data, you see this big jump in the open unemployment rate. For example, for the youth, it went up from 6.1 to 18%. Even if you break it down by educational qualifications, you'll see a jump in those with secondary education and above. It went from 5% to about 12%. So there's basically a big jump in the open unemployment rate happening in 17-18. Now, the numbers that I'm telling you are about the usual status. And like Professor Shyam Sundar said, I mean, one of the things a lot of us have been talking about and trying to highlight in recent times is that as we have moved from the NSS quinquennial round to an annual household employment unemployment survey, we need to look more carefully at the current weekly status as well, because that, because we have a problem of underemployment. The usual status counts all the underemployed as employed, and therefore, in some sense, conceals and masks the problem of underemployment. But also, if you want a sharper snapshot of what's going on in the labor market, and you want to capture these seasonal shocks, or even things like lockdowns in recent times, you need to look at the current weekly status, and that's again something that I'll touch on in the data. And here, strikingly, in 17-18, you saw a big jump even in the current weekly status in the data. And so just to give you, for example, for the country as a whole in the 15% age group, the unemployment rate by the current weekly status jumped from 3.6 to 8.9% between 11-12 and 17-18. And while the usual status number of 6.1% has actually declined by 1920, the current weekly status unemployment rate has in fact not declined even in 1920. So it's still very much at about 8.8%. And so that's telling us that this crisis is still very much there. And so when you were seeing this decline from 6.1 to 4.8%, I mean, you shouldn't be lulled into believing that all is well. So that's the first point of the unemployment rate. But of course, as we all know, the unemployment rate is not the only metric you need to look at. The labor force participation rate is another critical metric. Now, here again, if you look at the numbers from 4-5 onwards, 2004-5 onwards, what we see is that from 2004-5, to 11, 12, and then 17, 18, there has been a big decline in the labor force participation rate. It's gone down from 63.7% to 49.8%, which is a very, very significant decline. And a large part of this decline has actually been driven by the decline in female labor force participation rate, which has declined by almost about 20 percentage points between 4, 5, and 17, 18, from about 42% to 23%. So the decline in the labor force participation rate, coupled with a sharp increase in the open unemployment rate, which we've seen the data happening to 17, 18, is really quite worrying, because what it's telling us is that not only were few people entering the labor force and seeking work, but very few of those who were actually seeking work were also getting jobs. So this is, of course, a grave crisis. Now, on the labor force participation rate, like Professor Shyam said, we are actually seeing some interesting trends post 17, 18, where it's the labor force participation rate is gradually inching up. And especially for women, what we are seeing is that rate, the female labor force participation rate, which had declined from about 43% to 23% from 4, 5 to 17, 18, has now risen up to almost 30% in 2019-20. And again, this is actually a number which, when you look at, you feel is a very positive development, and it's very promising. But actually, if you dig deeper into the data, what you see is that a large number of these women are actually entering the agricultural sector as unpaid family workers. So a lot of this increase in female labor force participation rate, and even the decline in the open unemployment rate that we're witnessing, is essentially a consequence of distress-driven participation in the labor market. And that intuitively makes sense given the current economic scenario, the slowing down of growth that we've been witnessing in the economy since 17, 18. Now, again, when one talks about analyzing the labor market in developing countries, I think we need to go beyond what's happening to the unemployment rate and what's happening to the labor force participation rate. Because like we all know, looking at in poor countries, in countries where you don't have strong social safety nets, where you don't have unemployment insurance, people cannot afford to remain unemployed. So when people are not able to find the kind of jobs that they want to do, they will do pretty much anything that comes their way. They will in fact create jobs. So they will either resort to self-employment or casual work or whatever. So a very important indicator of what's going on in the labor market is to look at the kind of work people are engaged in and what is the quality of their employment. I won't go into too much detail into this, because at this forum, I think a few months ago, I had spoken on this issue in detail. But just again, to reflect on the more long-term trends. This is something which is quite interesting, because although the open unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate were deteriorating between 2004, 5 and 17, 18, the good thing that happened between 2004, 5 and 17, 18 was that actually there was an increase in the share of workers who were engaged in regular wage salaried work. And concomitantly, there was a small decline in the share of those who were engaged in casual work and in self-employment. And what is more that happened that between this period is that not only was there an increase in the share of those who were in regular wage salaried work from 14% to 23% almost, but also the share of those who were eligible for at least one social security benefit increase. So that number went up from about 45% to 50%. Now, this is a good thing, because like we know, if you have access to at least one social security benefit, you're classified as an informal worker in India. So that share was increasing. So you had more regular wage salaried work, and at the same time, people were getting access to social security. But what we are seeing in the data in more recent times, and this is shown in the 1920 data, is that now, while the share of regular wage salaried work has remained pretty much flat, but the percentage of those who are not eligible for social security benefits has actually increased, which means that basically while people are getting regular wage salaried work, they are largely in an informal work arrangement because they don't have access to social security. And this is an interesting trend also, which I want to highlight, because if you look at what's happened to informality in India in 2004-5 and 1920, you hardly see any change in the share of informally employed. And that is a function of basically two factors. Now, those who are informally employed are defined as those who are either in the informal sector or they are informally employed in the formal sector. And while the size of the informal sector, the share of those employed in the informal sector has been declining, the share of those who are informally employed in the formal sector has been going up. So as a result of it, on net, the share of total, the percentage share of the informally employed has remained pretty much flat in India. And I think after one of the most worrying things that we see in the 1920 data is that while the share of regular wage salary workers has not improved, it's actually declined by 1 percentage point between 1819 and 1920, but the share of people who are engaged as unpaid family helpers has increased, and that's increased by about 2 percentage points. And so the share of unpaid family workers in our total workforce stands at almost 16% in 1920. And for the youth, this number is as high as 25%. So the fact that you have an open unemployment rate for the youth of about 15%, coupled with the fact that about a quarter of your young workforce is engaged as unpaid family workers, is something which is a cause for alarm. Now, what is actually driving all these statistics on some level? I mean, of course, we are all going to do our own analysis and try to understand what's caused this. But to my mind, one of the predominant factors driving these trends has been the nature of structural transformation that India has witnessed since 2004-5. Now, between 2004-5 and 11-12, that was actually a really good period because in terms of appears, let me say that, because you saw a big decline in the share of those who were engaged in the agricultural sector. And that was actually the first time, if my memory serves me right, that in absolute terms, there was a decline in the number of people who were employed in the agricultural sector. But where did these people end up? They actually ended up in the construction sector. So between 2004-5 and 11-12, the construction sector saw almost a doubling in its share of employment from about 5% to 11%. And in many ways, this is not surprising because this was a function of the fact that there was a big impetus on infrastructure investment, on road building. And of course, as you know, some people have argued that this was not entirely driven just by investment in infrastructure and these sort of construction activities, but also because there was a lot of rural construction happening because rural wages were rising at that point. But after 11-12, what's basically happened is that the construction sector's performance in terms of generating employment has not been as stupendous as it was before. So the share of construction in total employment has stagnated at about 11 to 12%. So as a result of it, a lot of these people who were exiting the agricultural sector and were being easily absorbed into construction are not being absorbed to that extent. A lot of them are ending up in low-paid, informal work in the services sector, so informal services sector. And what we've seen recently in the 2019-20 data, in fact, is that there is actually an increase in the share of those who are employed in the agricultural sector. Now, this again is the second unique sort of inflection point that you're seeing in terms of trends in India, because consistently since independence, we have been seeing a decline in the share of the workforce which is engaged in the agricultural sector. And that is what we would expect to see, as per the Lewis model. But for the first time, we're actually seeing a big increase in the share in percentage terms of those who are employed in agriculture. And this again, this calls for a more careful thinking of some nature of industrial policy, employment policy in India, because the fact that you don't have any sector which is doing very well that can actually absorb people who are exiting the agricultural sector. And when I'm saying absorbing people, it should be absorbing them in well-paid, secure employment. Because one of the problems with construction also was that a lot of that work was very precarious in nature. About 80% of those who are employed in the construction sector are in casual work. So it's not what we call, good jobs or decent work. So, policy needs to think more carefully about what kind of sectors we need to focus on more sharply so that they can create jobs for these relatively low-skilled, unskilled, or even medium-skilled workers who might be exiting agriculture. Because at this point, agriculture in a sense is acting as this reservoir of surplus labor. But beyond a point that has an implication on our wages, which is again something that I had discussed in the last seminar that I was here. So there's clearly a lot which is line below some of the trends that Professor Shyam Sundar outlined in the beginning, and that's why he said that you need to take a lot of the numbers that are put out. You can't take them at face value, because when you see that decline in the unemployment rate or an increase in the female labor force participation rate, you might think that things are looking all right, but that's not in fact the case. There are some of them are masking a lot of distress in the economy. Now, looking beyond trends, let me say a little bit about the data. Now, I've chosen to restrict my remarks largely to PLFS. And of course, in recent times, there has been a lot of people have been using CMIE data excessively to understand what's happened in the post-pandemic context. And of course, while the PLFS most recent quarterly module, I think, is until September or December of 2020, CMIE gives you more recent information. But I think as a research community, we also need to think more carefully about how we use that CMIE data, because there are some concerns which are being raised about that data, especially the sampling strategy. Are we actually adequately capturing those who are at the bottom of the distribution? I mean, I don't have to this particular audience. We're all following the articles in the India Forum, where everyone from George to Jess Sampai and recently Salil Sanyal have written excellent pieces questioning the sampling strategy of CMIE. So I would say, one, while we do use CMIE to explain certain things because we don't have data from another source, but we need to think more carefully about the questions that they are asking and what their sampling strategy is. And to a certain extent, have they also underestimated the extent of distress that has been caused by COVID? I don't have answers to these questions, but I do want to raise them to a community which looks at this data a lot. Well, then going back to the PLFS, like I said, I think it's very important that we look more seriously at the current weekly status. And, as all of us write about these issues, we should try to anchor the policy discourse in the current weekly status, because our policymakers actually don't understand the current weekly status. They look at the usual status. But having said that, I think we mustn't discard the usual status as well, because, the Dantwala committee, which was set up before the NSS started surveys, clearly said that you need to look at all three measures: the usual status, the current weekly status, and the current daily status, which for some odd reason the PLFS doesn't report, but we can construct from the unit level data. Because the usual status measure does offer one important benefit, which is that it is the only measure from which you can compute the absolute number of employed or absolute number of unemployed, because you have a reference period of a year, as opposed to the current weekly status and the daily status, where you will get person days and person weeks, because everybody's reference period is different. So you can't actually use it to get absolute numbers of employed and unemployed. So I think it's important that we continue using the usual status, but at the same time, we use the weekly status more in our discussions. And then finally, Professor Shyam Sundar also talked about the new quarterly employment survey, which is there. Now, that survey goes to the enterprise size. And of course, the household surveys are very important, because the household surveys capture both the organized and the unorganized sector. And given the way things have evolved, I think they do provide us with the most accurate picture of what's going on in the labor market. But nevertheless, enterprise side surveys like the quarterly employment survey are all welcome, because we do need to understand what's happening in the organized sector as well. The ASI is another excellent data source, but the trouble is it comes out with a lag of 2 to 3 years. So the QES actually serves as a welcome development, but I do have to flag that it's not quite clear why we have this QES at this point, because this is not the first time that the Labour Bureau has done a quarterly employment survey. It started this exercise in 2009, and that was done in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, where they looked at select labor-intensive export-oriented industries to understand what was happening to employment in them as a consequence of the crisis. And then in 2016, they expanded their quarterly employment survey to cover more sectors and more industries and increase their sample size. But in 2017, there was, many of you would remember that there was this famous task force on improving employment data, which was headed by the chairman, the vice chairman of the IMPRI. And what they said at that point was that we're not going to look at this quarterly employment survey, because the frame for the quarterly employment survey was coming from the economic census of 2013, which according to them was dated in 2017. Ironically, we have a quarterly employment survey of 2021, which continues to use the frame of EC 2013. So I'm not quite clear what the purpose of this exercise has been, but therefore I would just say that we should take those numbers that are put out with a pinch of salt. Also, the 29% number, which is being cited, is again needs to be interpreted with caution, because it is comparing the estimate that you're deriving from the quarterly employment survey with the employment number that you get for those 9 sectors from the economic census. And we know, and you know, this is well documented in various reports by the National Statistics Commission, that the economic census tends to underreport employment. It is not designed with the objective, in fact, of measuring employment. It is just designed with the objective of creating a frame. And the way the question is asked is fundamentally different in the QES about employment from the way it's asked in the economic census. So I think, you know, that's something we need to think about. But again, I mean, let me just go back more broadly to then saying that, you know, how we look at the employment data is important, because in some sense, I feel part of the reason we got here was because we chose to look at certain statistics. We continue to look at the open unemployment rate, which in India never went above 3% until 17-18. And so we always never really recognized the enormity of the challenge of underemployment. And now we are stuck with a big problem of both underemployment and open unemployment. And we can expect to see rising informality. You know, there are a lot of purposive surveys which seem to suggest that this is happening now. So we do have a big challenge, in having good data at hand and analyzing that data properly is very important to tackle these challenges. So with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't take too much time.
Oh, it's fine. Thank you very much, Professor Radhicka, for giving the historical sweep and also covering comprehensively, relying very much on the PLFS and providing broad strokes of the labor market scenario. I just have a couple of questions which you could possibly address at once the discussants' observations are also made. Like, we have this inflation target and tolerance levels set by the RBI between 4 and 6%. Are we moving from 3% unemployment rate during the command economy to a new normal of admissive tolerance levels of 6%, 6 to 8% unemployment rates in India? So is it the new normal tolerance unemployment rates? Anything above, let us say 5 to 7% should be okay. So this is my question number 1. And question number 2 is that, do you think that given the economic slowdown that we have witnessed in the last 3 years, notwithstanding the revised to 8.1% for 17-18 growth rate, and also the COVID levels and others, the rise in labor force participation rates or workforce participation rates typically take at least medium term or long term to take that kind of a magnitude of rise. But this has taken place in a span of 2 to 3 years. Do you think, this is tenable? These are the 2 questions that I would request you to consider. Before I invite Dr. Gayathri Vasudevan, I would also want the panelists to think about, for example, Professor Radhicka Kapoor spoke of employment policy. We don't have a national employment policy in place. So, can the panelists think about them? And also, she also mentioned in passing, weighing the merits and demerits of official statistics of PLFS and CMIE. Maybe Dr. Ishan could think about it. But more pertinently, what do the stakeholders at the ground level think? So I request Dr. Gayathri Vasudevan to address.
Thank you, Dr. Shyam Sundar. And, this is the second time I'm going after Radhicka in a very short span of time in a panel discussion. And I'm always amazed by the richness of her analysis. I'm going to restrict myself, as I do not have that much familiarity with data sets, to how I observe it in the field. as a practitioner and an implementing executing agency in a sense. So let me sort of try and take off from some of the statistics that Dr. Radhicka brought up and tell you what I've observed in the field. The one is, I think, the education level. People going into secondary education, that means completing a 12th standard and going into colleges has increased in the last decade. And my observation is that the unemployment, open unemployment, is coming from this group of people. In tier 2 colleges, tier 2 cities, these are the two places, and I'm consciously sort of segregating this. In urban areas also, there are a number of colleges which are not giving us quality education, and therefore the students' aspiration to jobs, there is a huge gap. And I often feel that there is a lost generation. That means there is a group of people who spend anywhere between 3 years to 10 years looking for a good job. So they don't work at that period of time. They keep looking for a good job. And then desperation hits, right? So you reach the age of 25 to 30 years, and that's when you pick up any job which comes your way. And that job is in, I like the way she said, informal sector in the formal sector. For example, those could be piece rate jobs in the formal sector, which is the entire, much celebrated fintech sector. It has created enormous jobs across the country. The logistics sector, if we sort of look at where the money is going, the money, if I look at where, VCs, PEs are investing money, it is going into the fintech sector and the logistics sector. These are the two, e-commerce broadly, but within that also logistics plays a very big role. So if I look at these areas, I often see that what age group do people come in, it becomes very important, right? You see that what they call off-roll, on-roll. So the off-roll is what one is talking about. This off-roll group of them has been increasing. So that's on the unemployment that my observation is on. The second one that I would look at is I was happy to see the statistics on construction, which means that construction, because of the boom in construction which happened, because of National Highway, the various infrastructure projects which are constructed, right? And I'm going to refer to two infrastructure projects, which is the National Highway and the metros. These are the two major infrastructure projects. Power plants were booming. At one time, organizations like us were supplying workers to power plants. The whole power plants collapsed around the 2013 to 2015. So you saw the number of workers required in power plants come down drastically. There was a lot of infrastructure companies which went under distress. And if you look at the statistics from that perspective, right? Who was in the NCLT? That means who is called for bankruptcy practically actually shows up saying where are the jobs not happening. So that means the construction sector could not absorb more workers because they could not pay vendors. And the construction workers sector works on a vendor relationship. So there are multiple subcontracting layering before it comes to workers. So I think that's the second major observation that I have on what's been happening over the last 15 years. So there was a point when it was doing well, these sectors were well funded, power, metro, and roads are practically constructed by the same contractors, right? Which are the infrastructure, large infrastructure contractors. Many of them today are sitting in NCLT. So on bankruptcy, and therefore growth there has been minimized there. So I think there is from a policy perspective, I would say it's very, very important to look at how are we financing these sectors. See, the whole, there's been a lot of conversation around infrastructure financing that has direct impact on workers, and a sector which was giving jobs, good or bad jobs. I hear that it was bad quality jobs, but I still believe they're jobs, And from a wage perspective, they are jobs which were decent wages. They were not regular wages, but decent wages. On a per day basis, they're decent wages. What was the problem is they wouldn't get it for the whole year. And there was no predictability in it. And that's the issue there. Similarly, I just want to spend a minute more on the construction sector. I was really also, basing it on who's there in the construction sector. The construction sector, the real estate sector, I've moved from infrastructure to real estate, which used to be family labor. So men and women used to work together. Today, all large construction sites do not have any women. They have eliminated women from working in the construction sites, right? That means it is only male migration which is happening. There is no female migration which is happening anymore. They even in the past, when they came into the construction site, it was a family unit which got paid, which means the man got paid, the woman did not get paid, but she was there in the site and there was accounting of her work. Now that accounting is also gone, she is not there, which means that the number of people in the villages who have remained back are women. Male migration, women remain back in the work. That means the ownership of the land, whether it is very, very small holdings or agricultural work, is being done by women, but paid to men. Because men are not there, men are in the cities working on construction sites, but women are left back. Women don't own that wage, which rightfully they should own the wage. And therefore, possibly, as I was listening to her, I was thinking to myself, possibly you're seeing a decrease in labor force participation of women, probably because they're not getting accounted as earning members, while they're actually working in family farms. When I'm saying farm, I'm using both animal husbandry and agriculture together. I'm sort of plugging it in. And the reason I make the statement is there has been a huge boom actually from an industry perspective in the animal husbandry, organized, right? You have the Sugunas, you have the Venkis, you have Licious, which is now in a unicorn. You have a huge number of companies which have come in, which have actually organized, particularly in the animal husbandry, right? That is dairy, chicken, meat. The entire sector is getting more and more formalized and coming into the sort of new economy, e-commerce markets, right? You name it and you'd find it there. If that is the case, that means somebody is working. If they're working, where does that income get accounted? I'm not sure is happening properly. And the reason I make the statement is, this is a classic sector where that whole, I like the way she said, informal sector. Because what happens is they give it in as contracts. Now these contracts are again, it almost goes like a subcontract, and they therefore do it like contract farming. If I would call it contract animal husbandry, it's the norm in the industry. If that's the norm in the industry, who is getting paid and who's getting accounted as getting paid, I think is very, very important for us to look at. Now, the third that I'd like to spend some time on is the age group. I'd like to sort of now spend time on who works when. So if we say our working age population is 18 to 60, if we look at it, and this is a purely observation-based comment that I'm making, is that every decade people change sectors, because the large number of them are in casual labor, which is very, very tough on the body. You need strength at a point of time. What happens is, after a point of time, there is a change in sector. That means people moving to quote unquote softer jobs and therefore lower wages will start from the age of 35. Now, I don't know which data set would give this, but this is my observation, as I said, looking at providing people jobs, right? When we look at it, you always see what is the age group that the market is asking for jobs and what is the age group that, what I often think to myself, what happens to somebody above 35? How is it that all the jobs that are, if you look at it, and here I'm not talking of formal jobs with PF and ESI, I'm just talking across board, right? Across board, I don't see a requirement for people above 35. So 35, 45 max, which means this entire group is going into that segment. It's not like they're not working. That's not true. The other one that I'd like to sort of again spend time is on the Manrega. If I look at the Manrega, my estimation, again, this is, I'm purely basing it on observation, is that the last year would have seen women go out of Manrega. If I look at job cards, etc., that have been demanded, men who have gone back have taken the jobs of women who were getting jobs in the Manrega. I don't have the statistics for it, but I am observing it in state after state, at least, as I said, from an observation perspective. And again, here I'd like to spend a little more time on the rural jobs, in a sense, that are available, right? If male migration is very high, which I'm assuming before COVID, last year, before the lockdown that you referred to, Dr. Shyam Sundar, you saw men go back. Men could not come back. Men, there was such a high male migration in the last decade. The last year, men could not come back primarily because of two reasons. There were no buses and trains. It was not that jobs were not there in the cities. The whole transportation has been nightmarish, right? You didn't have normal transportation available till about July this year, which means lockdowns went through lockdown 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. But fundamentally, that means the mobility increased, but mobility for the poor was not easy. And I'm going to take an example to explain this. People try to migrate people from West Bengal and Odisha to Chennai. There are no trains available. Normal charge, if it was about 1,200 rupees, here you had to spend 4,000 rupees, where the person comes into a job of 10,000 rupees and has to settle in. Therefore, you could see the cost of coming to the city was almost impossible, right? You didn't have enough number of trains, and therefore you had to look at other ways of transport. So I think that's another reason why possibly men could not migrate to the cities. And my estimation would be male migration or overall migration may be as high as 30%. So we have distress migration for jobs, which is very high. People come to urban areas. Now there are categories of urban areas. There's metro cities, there's tier 1, tier 2 cities. There is weak migration, there is monthly migration, and there is seasonal long-term migration, right? Across board, we are seeing that there is an issue there. So I think that's another thing that one needs to really take into consideration when they're there. So I'll just sort of wrap up now and sort of tell you where I think the issues are. Young people who are educated or consider themselves educated, and our quality of education is low, unfortunately, and we haven't married skills with education. This group of them is moving towards unemployed. So I know this is the question you posed to Dr. Radhicka, but I'll take the liberty to answer. My worry is it will move from 6% to even 12%. If the rates go, if the people who are enrolling in colleges do not get jobs, then they're going to take time before they pick up any job. They're not going to just go and pick up a job which their parents did. They're going to consider it a job which is not good. So that means we need to see that we don't have a push towards higher education without a plan towards saying what kinds of jobs can these people who are joining higher education go into. So that's, I think, that one. I'm not saying that the poor should not have higher education. That's not my point. I think the point is that what is the quality of TVT, what is the quality of higher education that we have is very important for us to consider. The second thing that is very important is the Manrega jobs that are there, we know are low quality jobs. But can they be converted to service sector jobs, which given the technology influx that there are, becomes quality jobs instead of the current kind of job cards, which are very, very basic. It doesn't cater. So again, let me take an example. For example, if you were to do nutritious growing of vegetables and fruits, that would not be considered matrika. Whereas if you look at where, again, I'm going with where the money goes, right? The money is going into sectors like this where they're putting in PEs and VCs are putting into money into sectors like this to get products. So if that is the case, we need to see where the marriage happens so we have better quality jobs which are created around us. So I think that's another one there. Women in labor force, it's very, very important to look at ownership of not only land, but other assets. If men are migrating and women are in rural areas, do women have access to that income? And if so, how are they? I personally believe they're completely under accounted for. They don't get counted at all. And the last is, of course, as I said, is the large policy sectoral shifts, right? Infrastructure is a classic we should learn from, where we put the money in, jobs were created, companies could not make money, companies collapsed, jobs collapsed. But there's not a lot of written on this. This has huge implications, right? Or in terms of which sectors do we want to invest in? I took construction largely because it's a 10 to 12% of the labor force. But if I take other sectors, like if I take leather, garments, same questions are there. Are these companies making money or do they require support? If these are job generators, what do they require as support to ensure that they happen? We all know that the MSMEs are the ones which create jobs. MSMEs are the ones which have not had the entire COVID period. A lot of them are going into bankruptcy. Banks are actually going after them and tightening credit. So that means cash credit is going to come down. Working capital is going to come down. In that case, the first people who will be hit are the workers who are in either formal or informal relationships with them. So I think this is where I wanted to say that policy to data to actual what's happening in market needs to be married together. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gayathri Vasudevan, for providing micro-level explanations. So, with regard to some of the macro-level statistical analysis provided by Professor Radhicka Kapoor, I was quite struck by a couple of observations that you made, that what happens, in the financial economy affects the real economy. And you took the example of the infrastructure and construction sector and their impact on the quality of jobs or the wage levels. And of course, you thought that wage levels were rather decent. But you provided a very important micro-level explanation for the increase in the female self-employed, which Dr. Radhicka argued by saying that they may not be getting the due. So that is why they get their unpaid self-employed rising. So that can be a micro explanation for the macro statistic that Radhicka has shown. But what was quite amazing is that there have been arguments relating to the garment industry, that there occurs a kind of a body mining of work, that garment workers are engaged when they are in the teens. By the time they come to the mid-30s or late 30s, they're rendered absolutely unusable or reusable. And they are just pushed, gradually eased out of the employment. But I know, being in B school, I know that if you are 45 plus, you are not considered for any of the plum roles in the organized managerial market. So there is some kind of labor market based on age, and that's why you said that there are sectoral shifts that are taking place. But I would have two questions for you, Dr. Gayathri Vasudevan. One is that what could be the policy inputs for making of an employment policy by Government of India, given your enormous field experience? And secondly, how can activists and trade unions and various kind of civil society organizations, enable greater participation of women in MG Narega and prevention of stealing of even this kind of jobs, unskilled jobs that are there in the MG Narega. So these are the two questions, and thank you very much for providing a very important micro level explanation. Now I turn to Dr. Ishan Anand. Sir, over to you. Thank you very much.
Shyam, please unmute.
Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yes.
Right. So thank you to all the panelists and the moderator. Now, the only issue is going third, there might be some overlap with what the previous two speakers have said. So I'll just try to go a little fast when there is and see if I can make some other points. Okay, so there, and I'll also basically be dealing with the PLFS 2019. 1920, the latest available data set, and maybe I don't really have a lot to say about the CMI at this stage, but maybe later on, if there's a discussion, I'll be happy to add some things. There are three issues that mainly emerge from the latest PLFS, and it has become an issue because it has also gained official recognition. So if you read the replies in the parliament, right, and other official sources, so it is noted with some degree of pride that, look, the unemployment rate has fallen, right? And of course, the unemployment rate is based on the usual status, and we have already heard some things about it. We'll hear some more things. The second sort of puzzle that emerged out of the PLFS was the rise in real wage, the year-on-year rise in real wage during the lockdown period. That is kind of surprising. And the third, of course, is the rise in the female labor force participation rate. Now, this stress, of course, is very real, and one can look at the GDP figures. So what we have done is the PLFS is conducted between July and June. That is the survey year, whereas the GDP we know follows the financial year. But if we take the quarterly GDP data and we aggregate it as per the sample survey year, that is July to June, we find that for the same period, the real GDP declined by 3.4%. In that period, there is also more direct evidence available of the falling real wage rate. So the PLFS, like the earlier NSS surveys, categorize workers into casual labor, regular, and self-employed. And we now have 3 years of PLFS survey, and the reference year is, of course, 1 year before that. So from 2017 to 2020, one can see that the real wages have declined across worker categories. And not just, it's not just the rate of growth of wage that has declined. After 2019, the real wage itself has fallen. Right? So wages have come down. So there is a very direct evidence of distress in the labor market. Now, coming to unemployment. So as has been pointed out, we have trends which show more and more people, or the worker population ratio, basically the proportion of the population that is working, the workers in the population, that proportion has gone up and gone up quite significantly. The labor force participation rate has gone up, the unemployment rate has gone down. In absolute numbers, sometimes, we focus on the proportions, but it's important to look at the absolute numbers. Despite all this, despite the decline in unemployment rate, the usual serious unemployment rate, we have close to 27 million people who were unemployed, even in 2019-20. So that's a huge number, roughly 2.6 crore people. Right now, I will focus on 2018-19 and 19-20 because in this 1 year, the data shows a huge jump. But if we do take a look for the period from when the data is available, we see that in the latest year, 2019-20, the labor force participation rate there has been an unprecedented rise in almost all categories. So other than rural female, the labor force participation rate is at its peak in 2019-20. If we consider the last 40 years or so. Right? So what is going on in 2019-20? A year when GDP was declining, real wages were shrinking. the labor force participation rate is at its all-time high for most categories. For the female labor force participation, it is not at an all-time high, but it has increased sharply, right, in the last year. Okay. Now, so this is a joint work that I've done with Dr. Anjana Tampi, and I'm presenting these tables which are published somewhere else. But so what we did is we disaggregated. So who has joined the labor force? So we look at various disaggregations, and one thing that immediately strikes us is that for most categories, there has been a huge hike in the labor force participation rate of people who are 60 and above. So, so we look at rural male, the single biggest category, rural urban males, the single biggest category. So for males, older men are entering the labor market in 1920. As for the females are concerned, from the female population, there has been a rise throughout, but there is definitely a rise from even among the population of the older females, so 50 to 59. So older, the people who are above 60 have joined the labor force participation in greater numbers, at least for some categories. Now, so we know that the labor force itself has increased, the workforce has increased, but what has happened to the composition of the workforce? So, where are these people going? So if the labor force is changing, how is the composition changing? And again, the composition is interesting because a large proportion of this rise is seen as what is known as self-employed. Now, one can look at self-employed and say, look, this is a policy drive. We want people today not to be job seekers, but job givers. So that is one inference that can be drawn, and we'll see why that is not true. But the main rise has been in the self-employed segment. Within the self-employed, it is the unpaid family helper. Right? So unpaid family helper is a category which the PLFS captures. So basically, these are people who are helping their family members run the business. So these are small businesses. These are businesses typically which do not hire other people. They are family-run enterprises. So a major jump in employment, major jump in the labor force is in this category, the unpaid family workers. Right? As far as other categories are concerned, there has been some rise in the salaried workers and the casual labor also, but it is predominantly, of course, driven by the self-employed. Now, what about the sectors? It has again, been discussed in the initial comments itself, but the biggest gainer in terms of the sectoral distribution is agriculture in 2019-20. Now, this is again, one can say that, so if you look at this data, one can draw any number of conclusions. One can argue that, look, after all, the agriculture is becoming profitable. And we have had new schemes. We have PM Kisan in 2019. Maybe that has had an impact, or maybe, the other schemes. But the point is that the new situation assessment survey data was recently released, which showed that over the period of 7-8 years, we have again had a real the fall in real income as far as crop incomes are concerned, right? And agricultural income, if you leave the non-crop income, it has just about gone up, but income has come down severely in crop and livestock and so on. So agriculture is in crisis again, but the labor force in agriculture has increased. Another sector that has shown a big jump between 1819 and 1920 is the retail sector. So, and particularly in urban areas. And again, the previous speaker was pointing it out. So the e-commerce, so retail sector has gained. The catch here is this data, the 2019-20 data, has only 1 quarter of the lockdown period. Now, post-lockdown, we know that the retail sector was, massively impacted because of COVID and lockdown and restrictions. Right? So the retail sector, although it has gained in the pre-COVID period, But again, the people who joined this sector in the hope of some mobility might have actually faced a lot of setback given the phenomenon of COVID and lockdowns. Right. Now I come to, so all this of course points out that older people joining the labor force, agriculture which is in distress, does indicate that there is it is distress-driven employment. If we have to trust this data, because the sampling strategy is the same, the methodology is same, if we have to trust this data, probably the only plausible explanation of this rise in the workforce and the labor force and the female labor force is distress-driven growth. There is possibly no other reasonable explanation. Now, if we look at the lockdown period, so the PLFS 1920, of course, allows us to look at the lockdown period, April to June. Now, if we look at this period, something very interesting has happened. Now, in the current weekly status, the PLFS asks people or categorizes people into several categories, and there are two categories which are of interest here. So one category is, which is code 71 and 72, that is you were a salaried worker, you had a job, but in that quarter, you did not work. Likewise, in self-employed, so you had some sort of self-employment available to you, but you actually did not work. So usually, these categories are not important in terms of population proportion. The share is very, very small. But something very interesting happened during the lockdown. So we have compared April-June 2019 to April-June 2020, the year-on-year comparison. So what we see is the following. The proportion of people who had salaried jobs but did not work was only 0.6. It jumped to 7.2. So a large proportion, and likewise for self-employment, 1.3 to 8.3. So a huge number of people who had jobs technically, but couldn't work or did not work. So maybe they were benched, or maybe they had a shop, but they couldn't open it. So on and so forth. There are several possibilities. And what this number has done is, it has masked, in a way, the unemployment numbers. So the official record for unemployment during the lockdown is 14.7%. So current weekly status. So 15% of the population were unemployed. But if we look at the people who had work but did not, had employment but did not work, this number can go as high as 30%. And of course, it's not entirely correct to club everybody with unemployed, because there were some people who were not working but had incomes come, particularly the salary, right? But nevertheless, one can argue that the official unemployment numbers from the PLFS may be actually an underestimate. Because while it is true that the salaried might be getting some income, particularly people who are in better off professions, that might not be true for self-employed. So technically a person might be having a shop, but if you're not being able to open the shop, your income is gone. So you're as good as an unemployed. So this is another finding that has emerged. Now, what we have done is, we have looked at the share of workers who reported zero earnings. So the share of workers, as we can see, again, in this quarter is very, very high, both in rural areas and in urban areas. And in particular, in the urban informal sector, as many as 1/4 of the workers in the urban self-employment sector reported zero earnings during the lockdown period. They just did not have any earnings, which is not very surprising. And we must also remember that urban areas, unlike the rural areas, does not have any kind of social security. We do not have an urban employment guarantee scheme, for instance. So there is no fallback option. Right. Now, if we take into consideration, so what the PLFS report has done, or the NSO, the body which does this computation, what they have done is very interesting. They have gotten a report. In the report, you calculate the average wage. Right. Now, when you calculate the average wage, there is no obvious reason why you should exclude workers who are having zero incomes. That is just artificially deflating the average. Now, to be fair, on the NSO, they have been following the same methodology for the last 3 years. Why it did not make any difference is because that proportion was very, very small. There were very few people at any given point in time before the lockdown, who were employed, but they had zero income, right? So that proportion was very, very small. Even then, there is no economic sense in excluding that population. A farmer or a small business can, of course, report zero incomes or negative incomes. So there is no economic rationale to exclude them. But in the lockdown, as we have just seen, this proportion just overshot and reached unprecedented heights in the 12 quarters of data, 16 quarters that they have available. So what we have done is we have revised the average wage estimate of the PLFS by including these workers who reported zero earnings. And we feel this is the right thing to do. So when we have done this, so there are two estimates given here. One is the official estimates, which shows you that the rise in it's 2.0, the first, the urban, the regular wage salaried working class, that people who had regular wages, their earning grew by 2% over April, June 1920. So one can say, okay, the impact of COVID lockdown was not so bad after all, because look, the average earning of 25% of the workforce, that is the regular wage salary, has actually gone up. Likewise, if we look at the self-employed, we will say, okay, average earnings has gone down, but only by 7.6%. But again, this is artificial because we are excluding the people who have reported zero earnings. The moment we include this, we see that the size of the fall is huge. Right? So this is something that we need to keep in mind. We cannot, I'm not questioning the intention of the report, but as researchers, we do need to dig deeper before trusting some of the numbers which are reported, maybe officially. Okay, moving ahead. Now, something which typically goes unnoticed or less talked about when we're talking about macro level indicators. Now, again, youth unemployment was talked about, the educated unemployment was talked about. We have just looked at the disaggregation. So true, the overall, so this is again from the CWS, the current weekly status, 2019-20. And the current weekly status numbers, of course, remain unchanged for the 3 years. They were 8.8%. So this dark line, 8.8%, is the average unemployment rate. We look at the educated unemployment rate, that is the graduate unemployment rate, graduate and above, that jumps to 18.1%. Again, it's a huge jump, and this is in some ways acknowledged. But the moment we look deeper into caste compositions and gender compositions, we find that it is the deprived section of the economy, the socially deprived groups, and in particular, women amongst them, who are facing a disproportionate burden of the unemployment. So true that the unemployment is a problem, aggregate unemployment is high. It is hard to argue for anybody that it is in an acceptable range. It is surely, it should surely be questioned. But among certain sections, right? And this is the issue, because the whole argument about social justice is that if you provide them with education, maybe people will be able to climb the mobility ladder, right? Now, that of course seems to be a big challenge. Lastly, if something also related to this, if we look at, and I've not presented that data here, if we look at the public sector jobs, the numbers have almost halved. The permanent jobs, not including the contractual one, but the public sector jobs where actually reservations are in place or are supposed to be in place, the number of these public sector jobs have come down drastically in the last 10 years. So there are a public enterprises survey, which will give you these numbers. And given that the thrust of the current ruling dispensation during the lockdown was on, attracting more and more private business, even at the cost of getting rid of hard-won labor rights, working hours, right? And so many of them. It doesn't really bode well either for employment numbers, the educated employment numbers, nor does it bode well from the perspective of social mobility and social justice. So I would like to conclude here by just making 3 points. A number of new surveys that to be launched now. The Labour Bureau has already come up with the establishment survey. We will be seeing very soon the reports on migrant workers, domestic workers, so on and so forth. And they are they are saying that we need it for evidence-based policy making. Now, will actually be useful for evidence-based policy making if we draw the right conclusions from the data. If we look at the data and we say, okay, the unemployment rate has gone down, whereas we know that the current weekly status unemployment rate is actually up, and because the labor force participation rate is up, so the absolute number of the people unemployed in the current weekly status has actually gone up by roughly 4 million in the 2 years, 1819 to 1920. Right? So we need new data, yes, but more than that, we need to draw the right conclusions from the data. And lastly, the last point that I want to make, during the migrant worker crisis last year, it was said that we don't really have data, we don't know. But I don't think it is true that the constraint is data. If we draw the right conclusions from data, maybe in the existing paradigm, there is plenty that can be done to help the people who are clearly struggling, primarily because of COVID, but also because of this particular policy paradigm, and that is so much obsessed with growth and not really paying enough attention to things like employment and decent work and wages. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ishan Anand. In fact, your presentation was, in many ways different from the earlier presentations. So your apology in the beginning was, it was not needed at all. I'm particularly struck by two. You unraveled this quite a few, and I'm sure Dr. Rahul Sapkal is waiting to speak on them. Is that that people who were employed, who had an employment, but who did not work during this particular lockdown quarter that you identified were substantial. I mean, that kind of, sort of pulled down the unemployment rate. So that was very interesting. And secondly, of course, you said that 1/4 of the self-employed in the urban informal sector were, they had zero income. So my question to you would be that, could we, could we have this kind of evidence-based data to argue for an urban employment guarantee scheme? Is there enough meat in the data to argue for urban employment guarantee scheme, which several people have been talking? And of course, you had also brought about the disproportionate blow that socially marginalized and as well as female population that received, they faced the disproportionate burden of unemployment. There also, do you think is the need for affirmative action is strengthened? And of course, we have this current debate going on that we don't need reservation policy in promotions. The case is going on in the Supreme Court. Since you belong to the Jindal Law School, I thought I would allude to that. So these are my observations on your excellent presentation. Now I requested Dr. Rahul Sapkal to make his observations. Over to you, Dr. Rahul Sapkal.
Thank you, Professor Shyam Sundar. Thank you, IMPRI, for giving this opportunity to be a discussant for this wonderful panel, and it was excellent. I should not repeat the points what they have already made, but I'm trying to put them into a larger theoretical framework, and would like to have more policy interventions. So before we start, let's start from the questions from Shyam Sundar which he raised, that unemployment debate is now actually getting the center stage, and then have we really come to a new normalcy in terms of accepting 6.1 as an unemployment rate? So this also actually tell us that then we really need to look into the Phillips curve, the main theoretical argument which really see the relationship between unemployment and inflation, which supposed to be the inverse relationship. But what we are seeing, unemployment rate is also increasing, and simultaneously the inflation rate is also increasing. So is it really that too much unemployment, inflation is also bringing too much wealth inequality, social inequality within the society, and then people are not able to get their rightful share from the wage employment, And that's the problem is also raising. I completely agree, because the topic of this today's panel discussion was where we are actually heading. Are we really heading towards, the broader question, are we really heading towards, job loss kind of eras where we are permanently destroying the jobs, and we are not actually calculating where are these jobs are actually going? For instance, while enumerating worker, and when we use household survey, does the workers, the way we define in the labor law, it's been understood by the enumerator? That's the first question, because we have written about all these things. Many types of workers are not being considered. For instance, those who are working into the platform economy, and in the platform economy, all the platform service providers treat them as their executive, and hence, because they are not been covered under the law, and the industry is not being covered under the labor laws, rather they are being covered under the Information Technology Act. That's also works out as an exclusionary part, where we can see people are employed, but they are not being considered, as the employee of the company. Why I'm actually emphasizing the word on the job loss, because in the month of July, we had almost 399 million people who are employed. And then suddenly in August, we lost 1.3 million jobs because of the sectoral changes in the country. And this is the figures from the CMI data. And yes, we can discuss about the quality of the CMI data, because at the time when the data was not available, it was only the CMI who was actually producing the data, and many estimates and the policy influences has been brought by the CMI data also. But now the question comes, when the private agency collect the data, how far we can actually trust that data also? Because during the lockdown, we have seen many agencies have documented migrant and workers experiences of the pandemic and the lockdown, and they have covered, some have covered 5,000 samples, some have covered 10,000 samples, some have gone to up to 20,000 samples, and they have done repeatedly 2 waves of the survey. But when it goes to, at the policy level, with the bureaucrats, they often questions the data, the reliability of the data. Can we really take them, as a reliable data source? Yes, recently the quarterly economic survey, a quarterly employment survey has come up. But when we looked into the major, even though it was made to, show that the pandemic has a less severe impact on the economy, especially the MSME sector. So that was the main highlight. But if you look at the sample frame, and in the sample frame, 62% of the samples establishment is coming from MSME data, and they're employing more than 10 and less than 40% of the worker. So now, is it really question to me that, okay, if you're focusing only on the MSME sectors, then what about those who are actually employing more than 50 workers? Because most of this establishment will be excluded from that particular analysis. Now, I know, I know all the 3 panels have worked on the PLFS data, and PLFS data actually allows you to have, like a quarterly transition rate. So if I want to understand the dynamics of a labor market, I would not engage with, like a static, like a comparative statics. Rather than I will look into labor market as a flow and quarterly analysis. So what is puzzling, and I think that's more, if you take PLFS 2019 and 1920, in the first quarter, the female workforce participation rate you can estimate at, which will be a 78%. As the quarter moves, the female labor force participation rate drops from 68% to 15%. Whereas in the first quarter, when they visit, the male labor force participation rate is 23%. But as you go in that particular quarter, in the fourth visit, it increases to 68%. So it means that current weekly status, and if you aggregate at the quarterly level also, they are also not robust. And it is showing a diverging trend that why only in certain period the female labor force is very high and very low, why in particular quarter the male employment rate is very high and very low. It means the people are shifting. So there is a gross inflow and outflow which is happening, which we are not able to capture. So that's the first one. So we have to have the dynamic analysis so that we can understand the changes in the nature of a job, means separation rate which is happening, and then how it is linked with the industry and which industries are more prone, because this transition will also indicate us that which sectors are permanently been gone or permanently destroy the employment potential. Yes, I completely agree with the Gayathri ma'am, because Gayathri ma'am has brought too much qualitative issues and also the practical ground reality about why female labor supply is actually declining for a female. but also one hand that female labor force participation rate within the household unit and quarterly employment survey exclude the household unit, and hence we are not able to see their female labor participation in the quarterly employment survey. Yes, we are yet to, if you look into the NIC classification, they still go with the very traditional understanding about the way they are actually categorized the industry. But we do have an impact where the supply chain is actually coming up, where we can use claims database. In the claims database, you can understand from input to output process where the labor is engaged, gender and the dimension about that labor also. So we really need to understand employment intensity as a unit of analysis rather than occupation as a unit of analysis. So that will give us a scale that what is the unemployment scale in that particular industry, what is the employment scale in that particular industry. Yes, I completely agree with what ma'am is saying, that economic mobility, social mobility is constrained in the Indian labor market. And that has also come up in one of my papers where we did a couple of years back an experiments where workers, where the students, grad students, when we uploaded their dummy resume, and we found out that if they're from the SC and ST, so 13% lesser chances that they will get a call from the potential employer. And if it is if the candidate or maybe student coming from like a religious minority background, they will at all not get a call from the potential employer. So somewhere also deep down, the employer prefers to discriminate candidate based upon their resume, their surnames, their socio-economic background, and that is really hardly. So where this discrimination is actually taking place? So discrimination most likely is taking place into a professional sectors as well as in a high skill sectors, whereas we did not find any discrimination into mid skill and maybe lower skill occupations. Now in the COVID-19, people were asking that suddenly the rural unemployment rate has actually increased a lot. But here we are also saying rural employment rate has increased, but since those who are working into the low wage, low productive sectors, they are now reinforcing the caste identity, and then they are going back to their caste based occupation also. And that we have actually documented in one of our surveys, that those people who left the job from urban markets, they were forced to accept the jobs, low paid jobs, or maybe caste based job in their development. The last point I would like to make, Ishan has covered almost all the point, but in Ishan, you made that point very rigorously, that when you look into the self-employment and you exclude working and non-working. So what are the qualitative characteristics you found out in that two groups, where in one PLFS, second PLFS, they were working and suddenly that dropped out. And when you actually include that in the unemployment category might go more than 40% during that particular quarter also. So what we can really infer, that these guys have actually lost the job, or these guys are actually, they were waiting for the good job. Because in one of the survey, we found out that during the lockdown, those regular workers who lost the job, but their willingness to wait for the good wage offer or the salary offer, so they were actually working on the waiting period to get the good offer, and hence they were not willingly participating. So how will we model them into understanding about the unemployment rate also? On the contrary, the low wage job, the semi-skilled or unskilled workers, they were not actually willing to wait, and they were actually accepting whatever the jobs they will offer, and hence in that segment the employment rate was actually very high. So we really need to see that which sectors has sector specific understanding about where it is they're willing to wait for the right time or willing to refer. So with this, I would like to stop here. This was my point. But yes, now we are actually working on how the data actually can plays out very important role. And coming back to Professor Shyam Sundar's points, we required, like a data repositories where quality data could be given, and then instead of having multiple sources of data, and that's where we are also struggling, like Radhicka has in the beginning mentioned that you get information from ASI data, you do also some information get from the economic census, and PLFS is already there, the CMI is also there, independent agency, they are also collecting the data. Multiple sources of data always create an overlap, and hence any precision estimations is not been derived from that. So we should need to have, like a household based data, which is more reliable, but that the frequency should be very high. The frequency should be very high. So with this, I would like to stop here and yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rahul Sapkal for the excellent technical analysis of the data sources and the need for, I mean, you also made an important point that it cannot be comparative statics and it should be a dynamic a process, because labor market is it's not a stock, it's about flow. So what I will do as a moderator is to ask Dr. I mean, we'll reverse the order of response. Dr. Ishan Anand, could you?
Yeah, so very quickly, thank you, Rahul, for those comments. Very quickly, yes, this whole debate about affirmative action. And now this is not just, as far as the reservation is concerned or promotion. One can clearly see that we have had some established principles, in our constitution, and even after that, there were some principles which were at least officially settled. Right now, that is suddenly being debated. For instance, do we need reservations at all? Do we need reservations for people who are economically poor but not because of caste? And we see in some southern states, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Karnataka, where socially dominant groups, so there are special schemes for Brahmins now, right? So this is wider debate. I wouldn't want to go into that, but my sincere comment is that I think we'll be doing a disservice if we move away from the direction that was enshrined in the constitution, in terms of promotion, in terms of public sector, so that there is at least some mobility. Urban employment guarantee, it is high time that we have an urban employment guarantee. Many countries, even if they do not have a guarantee per se, you have some sort of unemployment relief. And in the US, we saw, so in India, at least you have something to fall back upon, that the workers will walk hundreds of kilometers to go back to their fields and villages. Right? In industrialized setup where you do not have this, people rely on allowances, unemployment allowances. So urban employment guarantee is a must. I don't think it is debatable also. We must have it. It can also look into different things, such as, trying to mitigate the climate crisis. So, these schemes can play important roles in several aspects. Again, I'll not go into all of them, but the last comment that Rahul, two things very quickly I want to talk about. One is the education and employment mismatch. Now, there is little doubt in my mind that the quality of education is, of course, not uniform in our country. And poorer states, districts, regions, generally the quality of education is not up to the desired level. But that, having accepted that, I would still argue that unemployment in a country today and youth unemployment is largely a demand-driven issue. It is not a supply-side issue. And as a counterfactual, if we say that let's assume the entire youth in the country today gets the best possible education, can we imagine what the unemployment rate will be? So I would argue that it's, yes, there are of course supply-side issues, but it's largely a demand-driven unemployment distress. And to Rahul's point, the people who were they waiting, why were they unemployed during the lockdown? I think the question that the way PLFS captures this is, so basically these were the people who had employment. So it's not that they were unemployed. They were not waiting in the sense that they had a job, just that they didn't work. And of course, they don't capture the reason, but we know that the reason has to be the lockdown. You were not able to work. So these are the people who had work, but couldn't work because of the lockdown. And there is no reason to believe that, the number of people who are waiting to switch to some other job will be any higher during the lockdown period than it was in the previous quarter. So yeah, these are my observations.
Just one question has come from the audience to you, Dr. Ishan. How would you, what would you say that the privatization and the monetization plan that has been put forward by the Indian government and its impact on the labor market? This is one question that has come.
Yeah, so my brief answer is that already, as I said, the private sector jobs, if you look at public sector enterprises, that if you look at the job number, that in the last 10 years, it has come down from around 15 lakh to, it has just halved basically. Now, if we go down this road, there is no evidence. Look, private sector investment in our country has been falling from before the COVID period. So the issue is that the investment is not coming. The private sector investment is just not coming. and the world economy is also slow, so exports are not happening. Now to argue that suddenly, some 6 lakh crore, first of all, we don't know what is going to happen, who is going to buy, how much are they going to invest. So if we are depending upon jobs from the private sector, first of all, we are seeing that has not been happening from, if you look at the period after 2011-12, the economy has just slowed down. That has not been happening. So there is no reason to believe that suddenly the private sector will start investing in employment intensive sectors and will be getting jobs. There are two related dimensions. One is that of labor rights, and Professor Shyam Sundar is there, so I am hesitating to speak on that. But it will have devastating consequences for the hard-won labor rights. And lastly, this the entire paradigm of social justice. So whatever little the pie of jobs in which there are reservations, that pie has been shrinking. If you squeeze that pie even further, so there will be a class impact, there will be a caste impact, and an intertangled gender impact. I don't see it as a very promising prospect.
Thank you very much. To you, Dr. Gayathri Vasudevan.
So I think there are two major issues which I think Rahul as well as Ishan had brought up, and I thought let me just allude to that. In my opinion, one of the key things one should look at is where is the money going in. So if private sector investment is not coming in, there is still some amount of rotational money which is coming in. Right? The fintech sector, where the growth is happening and where jobs could get created. So I think these sectors that are creating jobs, we are not actually looking at this quality of jobs. And a lot of it is not getting accounted. It's sort of falling through the gaps that are there because it's household labor, it's family income, who owns is not there. I think that's an issue. Second thing is, I think the whole MSME sector, we often think of it only as manufacturing, whereas today it is a heavily service sector. Agri and service sector is a very, very important one in the MSME sector. And one of the comments that Rahul had made was, above 50 workers that are there. There is a significant number of companies in that group who employ there and are getting missed out because they are so stressed. And credit is, I think, very lopsided. Today, there is no way the entire policy, which, the sort of packages which came, none of the MSME could use. I mean, it's well reported that only 15% were able to use. And the reality is more than 15% were impacted. That means any company which is over 5 crores to, let's take 300 crores or 400 crores, has been deeply impacted. They're deeply impacted. The natural progression is that workers are going to get impacted. So I think it's very important to look at the stressed, the stress on private sector. If public sector jobs are not happening. Yesterday, there was a front page newspaper article which said that, number of teacher vacancies in rural India. These are places where I'm not saying only public sector jobs, but government jobs can get created. In that case, we should look at, say, wherever there are vacancies, fill the vacancies, right? Which is in necessary sectors, health, education. These are places where there are vacancies. And similarly, I can take labor itself. In the labor department itself, you'll find labor officers not available. And that's a problem we all face on a regular basis when we go in for registration of workers, like construction workers, there aren't enough labor officers. So I'm just saying, just take the broad brush of where the vacancies are there. Not saying create new vacancies. Where vacancies are there, get them filled, then the public sector or government jobs will get in there. At the private sector level, in my mind, it is purely, if equity is not going to come there, at least we need to have the banking sector as well as the, taxation, which needs to be considered. So, a lot of these, now, for example, GST is a positive which has happened, right? It's not a negative which has happened. But GST has implications. When you pay the money, Are you going to pay the worker? Are you going to pay the vendor? Are you going to pay GST? This is the choice that an entrepreneur has to make. So if a small entrepreneur, a medium entrepreneur has to make this choice, and if there's tightening there from a target perspective, and banks are tightening on this level, companies will fall. If companies fall, there's no way that payment's going to happen. So I'm saying this entire spectrum of implication of financial markets, banking, equity, subsidies. Like, for example, the developed countries, US included, did a lot for its small businesses. But for us, the definition of small business was so small, it didn't have impact. We needed to have broadened that definition of what is small business. One can argue they had the money and therefore they could do. Fair. But at the same time, for us, we didn't have a choice. We should have done it because we had so much unemployment happening, right? People were, falling like flies. So from an employment perspective. So I think it's very, very important for us to look at these two. So I think I'll just summarize by saying two things. Very important to look at the financial instruments. Who gets a loan? How do they get? We keep thinking of ourselves as self-employed, micro enterprise, but remember there's a value chain. The value chain is impacted, it impacts everybody. It's a broad brush collapse which happens. And that's why I took the power sector example. The collapse of the power sector would have had huge impact down the line. So I think we need to look at value chain analysis and see that the sector is thriving. You can't look at it in silos. So labor rights have to be looked, in my opinion, in the context of a sector. So labor rights are important, critical, but in the context of the sector. Then we will do the whole sector good and everybody, there's no good or bad person there, right? Currently, it's always pitted one against the other. I think that's a problem that I would say is to me the most severe problem. I've already made my comments significantly on the gender issue. I genuinely feel that the way it is accounted is completely, and this is not a problem with data alone. It is who gets paid. That's where the problem lies. The ownership structure of not only an asset, even the human work is not counted. That's the issue.
One question from the audience, Gayathri Vasudevan. Someone asked, can we consider MG as a reason for decline in women employment in construction sector, since women can earn without much strain in MG at the native place itself?
No, I actually think it's a different problem that is there. This is one of those, strange policy issues, positive affirmative action, which has caused the problem. You see, construction sites had to give provisions for security of women workers. That means toilets had to be constructed, creches had to be there. So what the sites have taken as a call is, I can do bunk bedding, I can do better living quarters for male migrant workers. Why do I need to get women in? Don't bring the women in at all. So it's actually come from a positive thought process saying, please provide this on sites. But having said that, that provision has to be there. What has happened is that affirmative action has pushed women back. And another area I also fear a similar kind of thing will happen is paternity leave. If paternity leave is not there, they'll think, oh, I employ women, women will take 6 months. I mean, are you telling me all women get pregnant at the same time and take maternity leave at the same time? Not, we know that cannot be true, right? But having said that, there's those sort of perceptions push women out of labor force. So policy is very, very important. The nuance of the implication of policy will affect very badly.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Gayathri Vasudevan. I think we have had a very interesting and productive evening today. We had the benefit of three panelists giving us multiple perspectives and deep dives into the data, and also micro level experiential presentation by Dr. Gayathri Vasudevan. So, and also Dr. Rahul Sapkal had made very interesting technical comments. We all need to, I mean, at least I'm quite well informed now, well, better educated than I was. So it's time to conclude. I request Dr. Rajin Kumar to take over and do the concluding part of it.
Yeah, if you suggest, we can also move towards way forward round, 2 minutes to each panelist. And sir, if you want to summarize them.
Yeah, we could do that.
Oh, just 1-2 minutes, or let me also pose few way forward questions just to include from the deliberation. And that was mainly to Ishan also, that NSS or the PLFS data which we have is also, labeled to be more biased towards the lower strata or poor section of society. How do you see this as a conundrum for what is happening in the labor market? And linked with that, we have now many administrative data, eShram portal, PM Kisan, ESIC, EPFO. How do you see that data aligning with what the employment and employment scenario we have? We also have unemployment exchanges, doesn't work very much because of the situation. How do you see if we use these levers, and when we are talking about urban employment allowances, from where the money will come, what Gayathri ma'am was suggesting, how do we fund that? Do we also have some cess in that, just like in petrol or in diesel prices that gets in? How do we see it can be substantial so that we tackle this problem in short to medium term? Also adding to that, how do you see the conundrum of our youth population joining and not joining the workforce? Since their benchmark is also high, how do you see that going forward? And if we align them towards our labor market? And yes, one more question I just had with Gayathri ma'am. Many people, Radhicka ma'am, and all of us are also writing that small MSMEs are not getting the fund. Ma'am, how do you see this, how to eliminate this problem? Because this has been well established, and we have Mudra and other levers also, but small establishments are not getting that fund. So that business, how do you see the way forward also as the ease of doing business? How do we move ahead with that? And do we also constitute some fund, like we have a housing fund, or what do we do with that? Because banks are really very reluctant to give money to small. So many of regulations and procedures it has. So really moving to the way forward, 1-2 minutes. Shall we start with Gayathri ma'am, then Ishan, then Rahul sir?
So see, to me there are two issues. Okay, one is the micro businesses. So we should divide, let's take by range. So like, for example, those who are in the 10 lakhs and below, 1 crore and below, 5 crore and below, 50 crore, 100 crore and 250 crores. Let's take up to 250 crores. This entire segment is, you have to treat it very differently. So the 250 crore and below companies that are there, that is between 100 to 250 crores, are actually small businesses. They're not very big businesses. But it is because in India, you have such a large number of 100 to 250 crore that we have, started seeing them as mature. They're not mature. They're still pygmies. They're not big businesses by any account. These businesses have really struggled with complete closure over the last year, because of first the lockdown, then the market itself picking up. Market doesn't pick up in a day. Market takes time to pick up. So I think here what would be important is banks just not pulling back now. So if they look at last year's profit and loss statement or balance sheet, obviously this year they're not able to lend. So working capital is where they're really getting hit, and therefore a lot of them are actually don't have liquidity. If liquidity is not there, they're not able to participate in hiring, in growth, none of those elements. So you will actually have a lag period decline if you don't address it. Then many of the schemes have been for the, as you said, mudra, So there are 3 types of mudra which is there. Now here it is well documented that it's difficult to receive because our entire loan structure is based on collateral. So collateral itself becomes problematic. So, and that's why I want to sort of put the categorization up to 250 crores. This entire mindset of collateralization becomes problematic. Who is going to give you guarantee? So government created guarantees, right? Government created guarantees and said, we will guarantee, don't worry, lend. But when you say lend, the question goes back to, do you have the balance sheet to lend? How will you have the balance sheet if the economy is down? So you get into this, one needs to go into the nitty gritties of why it is failing. To me, that's where it is. You need a clear SOP saying, don't ask questions. And this is an established one. Some of the countries outside India did it. We just have to copy it and say, okay, it didn't happen in this year, but in the coming year, let's get it right so that we don't have all the companies collapse. A collapse is likely to cause job losses. I think that's where I would say banking sector and the government policy sector. Government taxation sector, policy sector, and employment sector don't talk to each other. This is the fundamental problem which is there.
Thank you, Ishan.
On the data point, I don't have much to say because we have different kinds of data. Each might serve its own purpose. But the good thing about something like PLFS is that it has information on everybody. It has information on gig workers. It has information. Of course, it can be improved. But more. I mean, we are already seeing that 5 more data sets are to be curated now. So, I mean, the more the better. I don't have anything to say. All I'm saying is, at least you have to draw correct conclusions. One cannot draw, conclusions which suit our, narratives. So that is one thing. But the larger point that I want to make is, this question of where will the money come from for employment and not just employment. You can think of anything. Should people be given public education? Where will money come from? Should things like shouldn't JNU students pay higher fees? Or one can think of the public sector. Now, look, this is the main debate as far as I am concerned, and this is not a current debate. So we are having this debate for past 100 years, and we don't need to. So the whole experience of the Great Depression and post Great Depression recovery, and the economic tradition of Keynes and Kaliski. So this debate is kind of settled. I mean, it is not as if it is a new debate. We know that we can rely on fiscal deficits. We can have higher fiscal deficits, at least when economies are in crisis. There is absolutely no harm in borrowing. The government can easily borrow and spend and make sure that the economy recovers. But the issue is, amongst you take all the major countries and you look at the support stimulus that the governments have given around the globe. India, I think, along with Mexico, is almost at the lowest rank. And you say that it's a 20 lakh crore package, but much of it, as was being pointed out are just liquidity. So it's credit. Now firms are in a crisis because nobody is buying their products. So even if they get a lot of credit, lot of loan, who are they going to make it for? People don't have any incomes. And what you could have done instead is to transfer. So 500 rupees per month were given for 3 months, right? And rations. That ration scheme is also stopped now, right? So one could have made a case. The US is now discussing giving $5 trillion, and the US is hub of the neoliberal capitalism. But somehow I think the main constraint is ideological. So we have to this debate about ideas. I think one position that the state does not have any business in business, give away all the assets. Social justice can take care of itself. Jobs can take care of itself. We will look after growth. I think that paradigm is the issue. Where we'll pay from is not the issue. It can be resolved.
Right. And the government is also saying that it will not be a matter of 20,000 crore or 50,000 crore estimate from APU. What Professor Santosh Mehrotra is saying, that if we give the PM Kisan amount only, it will accrue to 20. And government is saying, okay, we'll do it. But Rahul sir, I'll come to you just also for your way forward. Sir, as Gayathri ma'am is also highlighting, there is no impact. And institutions are not talking to each other. Niti Aayog is not ready to, accept it, the government data and all the data sets. Even if we have, how do we make impact in our youth and in our employment market? How do you see the way forward? We also have PM Swanidhi, something. So there are, in pieces and bits, there are so many of efforts. How do you see, we see our population having a sustainable and decent employment, as Ishan was highlighting? You can also conclude, yeah. Please go ahead, Rahul sir.
Yeah. I will tell you from my own personal experiences. When the COVID pandemic started, and all my co-panelists also know, it was under the
Congratulations.
guidance that we conducted in the first round in collaboration with ActionAid India. We collected 15,000 migrant workers across 28 states. In the second round, when we presented this data to the Niti Aayog, and we documented the job loss, earning losses, also COVID-related deaths also we have documented, but they were actually not happy with like a sample size. So then we increased the sample size. Like we in the second round we went to a 25,000 migrant worker, and then we were actually selecting those workers who were re-interviewed, but still like the data was actually not because the think tanks do not buy unless and until it shows their position is not weak. Position is not so strong, so they always they will not buy. Now we are going for in the next month ActionAid is going now with the third round of the COVID survey, so they are resurveying. So we are collecting the data, but that we will do our academic work, but when it comes to influencing the policy makers should need to accept our analysis also, our data also. They will not always highlight the good points of the data. They will always criticize the bad point in the data, and that's exactly happened like when the NSSO estimates were not being used. And you remember in 2017, and Shyam Sundar sir and I have also written on this, that ESIC data was actually extensively used to understand what is the net inflow of a job and what is net outflow of a job. But the collection of the ESIC data and their tabulation formats, why the ESIC data show pick up during the last financial quarters when the income tax filing is also very high, and it showed no. So when I'm looked into the labor market as a like a dynamic process, in that way that transition was not been able to capture, and many workers who could not renew, or maybe they could not renew their membership with the ESIC, they were completely left out of that survey. So that is also one of the concerns we have. Yes, definitely PLFS is a good start. PLFS covers the extensive range. We can actually include, expand that range also. But now we need to understand, since it is quarterly based data, and that's our exercise for all of us, that we should now look into the quarterly level analysis, not at the yearly level analysis, quarterly level analysis, that we can actually capture the transition from each quarter to and then we can able to comment on what is the state of a labor market in India is right now. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being so patient. So let me just formally give a vote of thanks for this very interesting and insightful session. So on behalf of IMPRI Center for Work and Welfare, Indian Social Institute, and Counterview, I thank all of you for joining us today on our series, The State of Employment and Livelihoods, #Employment Debate. And today on the panel discussion on employment and unemployment scenario, where are we and where are we going? I thank all of you, all of distinguished panelists, our moderator, Professor Shyam Sundar sir, Dr. Gayathri Vasudevan ma'am, Dr. Radhicka Kapoor ma'am, Dr. Ishan Anand, Dr. Rahul Sapkal sir, and all those who joined here on Zoom and on Facebook Live, and later watching it on our YouTube and on our listening to our podcast. Thank you very much, everyone. And we hope that you tune into our future episodes of #Web Policy Talk. Thank you. And I wish you all a very nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you.